I like to wander a little bit. It's a professorial habit. I'll start this way. Once upon a time, a man walks into a bar, and he sees his friend sitting over at a table, and his friend is staring down at the tabletop where there's this very small man playing this very small piano very beautifully. And the hero of our story, let's say his name is Fred, he walks up to his friend and he says, "Wow, he's so small and he's so good at playing the piano. Where did he come from?" And his friend says, "Well, he doesn't, first off, his friend doesn't look up. He just keeps staring down at the tabletop and he waves towards the back of the bar. He says, 'There's a genie out in the alleyway giving away wishes.'" And Fred wants some of this, so he runs out to the back of the bar. Sure enough, there is a genie standing there. He says, "Genie, please grant my wish. I'd like $1 million." And the genie nods his head, and there's this flash of light in the alleyway. And when Fred can open his eyes again, the whole alleyway is full, not of $1 million, but $1 million ducks. That is a lot of ducks. So he's like, eye deep in duck. He manages to get through these ducks to get back into the bar, and he yells at his friend. He says, "Can you believe that stupid genie? I ask him for $1 million. He gives me $1 million ducks." And his friend finally looks up from the tabletop, and Fred can see that he's been crying. He's got this single tear rolling down his cheek. And he says, "Yeah, do you really think I asked the genie for a pianist that was 12 inches long?" I'm pretty ashamed of that joke. But it's the only joke I know. And I have a point about it. The point is that jokes are stories. And when we tell each other jokes, we're telling each other these small, funny fiction stories. You go to see a stand-up comedian, you're going to see a virtuoso oral story performer. And I think jokes are one of these great examples of the way that stories infiltrate, saturate just about everything people do, but in ways that we hardly recognize. I wrote a book about this. It's called The Storytelling Animal. Here's the Romanian translation by Valant. And the book gets in on this debate. And the debate is very, very ancient, very, very simple. And it comes down to this: what is a human being? What is it? What is it that most separates our species from the rest of creation? And when we call the species Homo sapien, that's an argument in the debate. It's an argument that it's our sapience that sets us apart. Sapience means wisdom. It's our intelligence. It's our big brains. It's our vaunted logic, our rationality. But other scientists, other philosophers say, not so fast. Have you met people? Have you met us? Have you watched the news lately? Really, we're not very reasonable, very rational most of the time. And so they counter. They say, well, maybe it's our upright posture that sets us apart. It's our opposable thumbs that allows us our sophisticated tool use. Or maybe it's the complexity of culture, language, or whatever. We're all aware of these arguments. But I'm here to say there's one thing that's typically left out of these debates, one thing of equal stature, and that is the way that human beings live their lives inside stories. So Homo sapien, yeah, I think that's a pretty good definition for the species. But Homo fictus, fiction man, story man, I think that might even be better. By the way, this is a photo from Life magazine, 1947. These are Kung San Bushmen, some of the last extant hunter-gatherers on Earth. This photo is one of my favorite photos of the storytelling animal in action. It's called The Storyteller, and there he is at the center of the screen. He's the guy who's got his hands up like he's a conductor. And I think that's so appropriate because he is literally orchestrating all the thoughts these people are having, all the imaginative flow they're having, all the feelings they're experiencing. He's brought them together, skin up against skin, mind up against mind. I like these two little guys right here. He's brought these people into hormonal attunement with each other and neurological rhythm. We'd be able to demonstrate this today in a lab. he's wielding this enormous power, and he's doing so only with this most basic human toolkit. He's got his, expressive hands, his face, and he's got his story, and that's all. And he's wielding enormous power, and I have no doubt that he's using this power constructively. He's using this power to heal. He's using this power to build. But in a room like this, full of storytellers, we can get a little bit self-satisfied, and we can kind of forget that this power he is deploying, this magic, these spells that he is throwing behind these upraised arms, this power can be used just as much to harm and destroy as to build and to heal. And we'll come to that a little bit later. It's the 1940s. I'm going to pause this for a second. And there's these two psychologists named Heider and Simmel. They come up with this very short, very crude animated film. They show it to 120 people. At the end of the film, they just ask this very simple question: will you please tell us what you saw? And what we're going to do right now is we're going to watch this little film. It only lasts about a minute. And at the end, I'm going to ask you guys that question. What did you see? And we're going to see if we can replicate this very famous experiment right here, now, in this room. So I'll shut up for a minute and we'll watch this film. I love showing that little film because there's a moment at which it sort of clicks for people and they start seeing something. And you see smiles and a little bit of laughter breaking out in the room. So the first question I have for you guys is, who saw, and I need a show of hands on this, when you're watching this little video, who sees a story, some kind of story? It doesn't matter what the story is. Yes, we have a sea of hands, a veritable sea of hands. Now I need a few brave people to give me a little more feedback, to tell me what specifically was the story you saw. And I have one constraint on this. I need you to be kind of brief. I need you to use one sentence, two sentences, three sentences, because in order to replicate this experiment, we need to hear from several different people. Yes, please.
A dad who abused a child and her mom.
Okay, who sees that? I call this, let me say it again. This is what I call the bad daddy narrative. Okay, a domestic abuse type narrative with a dad abusing his family. Who sees that? Okay, about, I don't know, maybe 15% of the room. I saw your hand second.
It's an old man on Halloween, kids coming trick-or-treating.
Yes. I call this the Elfin invasion narrative. So in this version, the big triangle is actually kind of the good guy, and he's having his turf violated in some way by little elves. Somebody on this side of the room, or anybody over here? Is this the only side of the room that likes to participate? Okay.
I see a couple trying to elope and the dad does not agree.
There you go. Trying to elope. I call this what do I call this? Love triangle narrative. Although you're saying it's a disruptive father narrative. He's trying to stop the lovers. Other people often see a love triangle narrative where the big triangle is trying to split them apart, as you saw, but he's sort of a rival lover. A schoolyard bully. Okay, yeah. These are very, very common reactions. And we could go around the room and we would continue to find different variations on, I'd say, like 6 or 7 different themes. And we'll listen to one more here from the young man.
What I thought
A war. Okay. Who was the good guy in your war and who was the bad guy? Was there a good guy and a bad guy?
Not exactly, but the triangles look like Illuminati.
Illuminati, okay. Well, that makes him the bad guy, right? Or does it? I don't know. Don't strike me dead, Illuminati. This is fantastic. We replicated the experiment. Okay, so in the original, this is a highly replicable experiment. In the original experiment, 120 people see the film. Only 3 of them give a truly reasonable, rational, logical answer. The sort of answer you might expect from an animal that is vain enough to call itself Homo sapien. These people said, what did I see? I saw some triangles. I saw some circles. They're floating around on a screen. That's all I saw. I saw geometry. But everyone else, they see a story. They see a little soap opera. They see a little slapstick comedy. They see a little miniature epic, a little miniature saga. And I love this experiment because it reveals us as natural interpreters and creators of story. So it's not just that if I challenge you to look at that film and to turn it into a rich story, you guys could do that. That'd be kind of cool. But it's more than that. It's that when you watch that film, you can't not do it. You can't not do it. You can't help yourself. Your brain does it automatically, reflexively, on the fly, without you even trying. It's just how your mind works as a storytelling animal. And I think it is important and really sort of beautiful that we're all seeing different stories. I love that. If we were all seeing the same story, it would just mean that we were good at digesting a narrative that these 2 psychologists were feeding to us. We're just interpreting a narrative. We're interpreting a story. But the fact that we're seeing different stories here means that when we're watching this, when you are watching this, you're not experiencing a story. You're not enjoying a fiction. It is your mind that is authoring the fiction. And again, it's doing it automatically, reflexively, on the fly, without even trying. It's how your mind works. And I hope it's obvious that my point here has nothing to do with how your mind happens to respond to simple animation. My argument is that this is what we're doing all the time, every day of our lives as storytelling animals. We have this inrush of data into our brains, and we're constantly struggling to impose this meaningful, comforting order of story structure on all this chaos around us. So I said that I think this Heider-Simmel experiment is beautiful, but I also think it's pretty scary. In fact, I think the psychology it reveals may be at the root of some of humanity's deepest evils. This tendency, namely, for human beings to glom onto a narrative for no good reason at all, to then cling to it tenaciously and to use it to project patterns upon the world that aren't, in fact, there. Now, with this little video, we're not going to argue over what the true story is. No one cares. It's just a little cartoon. Who could care? But I think, as I'm trying to suggest in this slide, we have fights about these sorts of interpretations, these sorts of rival stories all of the time, with a lot of damaging consequences. And this slide is meant to reflect sort of my mood right now. It's a mood of pessimism about narrative. We often speak about the narratives that we have. She has a narrative XYZ, he has a narrative ABC. But I think it's truer to turn it around and to say that the narratives have us. If there's a master-slave relationship, I'm not sure the narrative is usually serving us. It seems oftentimes like we're serving them. So it would be kind of pretty to think that we formed our narratives rationally, like constructing them brick by brick out of facts. But I think it's closer to the other way around. We allow the narratives to choose our facts if the piece of information happens to correspond with our pre-existing narratives, then we credit it as fact. So stories have good sides and bad sides. Let's talk about where this power is coming from. There's a stat, that's some statistics on daydreaming in the storytelling book that are impressive to me. That we daydream about 8 hours a day. About 8 hours a day. We're just having these little fantasies, these little stories that are running constantly in our heads. These are hard to study scientifically, but the best estimates suggest that we have about 100 daydreams per waking hour, 100 of them. That means that our minds are just flitting all over the place all the time. I imagine that sensation is familiar to you. But when we are absorbed in a really good story, when we're watching our favorite show, when we're reading that novel we can't put down, or when you're listening maybe to some great raconteur, maybe on a podcast, we experience approximately 0 daydreams per waking hour. This wandering, hyperactive mind goes utterly still, and we can pay close attention for hours on end. Nothing else in human life has anything like that sort of cognitive effect. Now, this is very impressive to me. It suggests to me that story is a type of drug. It's a drug, and I mean it kind of metaphorically, but also I'm not really sure I mean it as a metaphor. I think I mean it pretty literally. The only difference is that a drug is usually something you ingest chemically to get the altered state of consciousness, and through stories we get the altered state of consciousness through a different method of ingestion. But it reliably, good stories reliably lull us into this altered state of consciousness. It's a state of consciousness that's typified by the high, rapt attention that I talked about. And also, importantly, and scarily, it's also a state of high suggestibility. People are very open-minded when they're in storyland, and this can be a wonderful thing. They're much easier to teach. They're much easier to talk out of bad ideas. But of course, there's a negative side to this as well. They're much easier to mold and manipulate. They're much more vulnerable. The neuroscience of the brain on story gives a little bit of insight into this. So you can take a person, you can slide them into an fMRI machine, and you can watch the brain while the brain is watching a story, or you can read it while the brain is reading a story. And if you do this, you find something that's pretty cool. It looks like the person in the machine is not so much a passive spectator as an active participant in the action. So, for instance, if Clint Eastwood is up on a screen and he's angry, and he's always angry, your brain looks angry too. If the scene is sad, your brain looks sad. It does not look, and this is important, it doesn't look like you are standing back passively and watching someone else have these experiences and go through these emotions. It looks like it's happening to you. We can give it another little video clip to get some insight on this. The clip I'm about to show you is from the horror movie franchise Paranormal Activity. And I love this trailer. It was a very influential trailer because what it does is it takes the camera and it shows you what's happening on the screen. Then it flips it and it shows you the effect it's having on the audience. One more? Okay, sorry. First time on PowerPoint.
What the heck? Did you hear that?
What's that sound?
There's something in here with this guy.
Here.
Katie.
Paranormal Activity 3. Rated R. October 21st.
That's pretty interesting. We're so familiar with that kind of response that we've lost sight of how utterly bizarre that is. That is utterly bizarre. Those people are not at their first movie, right? They know what they're seeing is fake. They know that blood isn't real. They know there's no monster, there's no witch, there's no danger. But these smart, sophisticated, and experienced filmgoers aren't just treating these fake things as real. This is what I'm getting at. They are acting as though those fake things are real and happening to them, just like the fMRI studies would suggest. Why else would they be doing this? Why else would they be doing those little dances in their seats, right? They're avoiding the knife. They're screaming, they're crying out for help. Did you guys notice this one moment where everybody on the screen at the same time pulls in their elbows and draws up their knees and they're kind of looking through their wrists? Like they're balling up to protect their vital organs. That's what they're doing. Their brains are telling their bodies to do all the things that they would do if they were actually under mortal attack. And I think this is part of the answer to why stories are so powerful for us. Because whatever's happening in the story, whether it's on a page or a stage or a screen or wherever it happens, it isn't just happening to the characters, it's happening to us as well. So you may know that the film is fake, but that doesn't stop deep, unconscious parts of the brain from processing it like real. So that's interesting. But for the people in this room, perhaps the more interesting question is, what are our stories doing to us while they hold us in these trances? So what are these stories doing to us? This is Tolstoy, one of the finest storytelling animals ever to have lived. And he is obviously the author of War and Peace, the author of Anna Karenina. I can't stop looking at the I need blinders. I don't know. Thank you. I really do appreciate it. It's been distracting me the whole time. So he's a great artist, but he's also this really adventurous philosophical thinker. And in 1897, he writes this book that I love, and I think you'd love it too. It's called What is Art? And he asks that really good question, really simple question. What is art? What is this stuff? Why do I like it? Why does it have this power over me? Why do I seek it out? And he's talking about art in all of its forms, but he's talking most particularly about his own form of art. He's talking about story art. And the book contains what is, for my money, the best concise definition of art I've ever heard. It is also, I think, the most provocative. Here's how Tolstoy defines art. Art, Tolstoy says, and here's the quote, "Art is an infection," unquote. Art is an infection. The whole point of art, Tolstoy says, is for me, the artist, to infect you, the audience, with my ideas and my emotion. The stronger my art, the stronger the infection. The better job it will do of getting around whatever sorts of immunities you might possess in planting the virus. And that's an interesting and modern and ominous sounding definition of art. And it's also a fairly prescient one, because more than 100 years after Tolstoy's death, this is pretty much what psychologists are finding in the lab. Let me give you a couple of quick examples from this research program. There's a study I like by this, he calls himself a neuroeconomist, Paul Zak. And he brings students into his lab. He pays them $20 to read these sad nonfiction story about a terminally ill little boy, a toddler who's going to die of cancer, and his grieving father. He takes a little blood from the students before they read, takes a little blood from the students after they read. And at the end, as the students are walking out of the lab, they have the opportunity, low pressure, to donate some or all of the money they earned back to a charity that served sick kids. They don't have to, but they can. Here are the results of the experiment. After reading the story, this sad, compelling story, oxytocin levels in the blood spike. Is this too close to my mouth? Am I like, No? Okay. I'm really self-aware up here for some reason. Oxytocin spikes. Oxytocin has been called the empathy chemical. And the more oxytocin there was in the blood, the more these cash-strapped, empathy-drunk students donate back to the charity that serves sick kids. And I think this study is interesting. It kind of goes with the drug metaphor. It suggests that stories change our behaviors, change our attitudes by actually modifying our brain chemistry. That's what they're finding in this study. And this is the other side of it that's interesting. If you just take that the information about the sick kid, it has to be presented within a classic story structure. If you just spray that data at the students with bullet points, you do not get the chemical changes in the brain. You do not get the eruption of empathy. And you don't get the behavior change, which is a pretty dramatic one, of people deciding to part with hard-earned money. They had to read a sad story. They had to get a shot. They had to get blood drawn. Parting with their money for a good cause. You don't get any of that stuff unless you tap into the power story has, this special, unique power story has, to rivet us, to rivet our attention, to rouse us emotionally, and to change how we think and how we feel. One more set of studies. Research also shows that popular TV shows that have a lot of reach can affect attitudes on a fairly grand scale. So shows like Monk, Different Strokes, Will and Grace, the Canadian sitcom Little Mosque on the Prairie have been shown to reliably reduce bias toward mentally ill people, African Americans, gay people, Muslims among their viewers. And they're encouraging studies because the effects seem to be stronger and more long-lasting than more traditional approaches to prejudice reduction. Things like sensitivity training, which don't appear to work very well, if at all. So this guy is the great English poet, philosopher, Coleridge. This is all sounding good, by the way, so far, right? It's reducing prejudice, it's empathy is occurring. So far, so good. But then we have this guy come along, Coleridge. And Coleridge is famous for many things, but he came up with this famous phrase, the suspension of disbelief. The willing suspension of disbelief. That word is key, the willing suspension. And the idea goes something like this. I'm going to read Beowulf. Beowulf is going to fight a monster named Grendel. I know this is bogus, but I'm going to switch off my skepticism for a while so I can enjoy this ride. But that's so not how it happens. We do not will our suspension of disbelief. If the story is strong, if the teller is crafty, it just happens to us, with or without our permission. I think this is reflected in the metaphors we use to describe what stories feel like. So we talk about stories, about what the experience of being in a story feels like. So we think of storytellers as metaphorical bruisers. They overpower us, they hold us down, they hook us, they grip us, they rivet us, they transfix us. All those are violent metaphors, by the way. Transfixing is what you do to a butterfly when you stab it down on a corkboard. So when you're talking about transfixing somebody, that language is about you getting speared and held in place. We think about storytelling, the experience of being in a story. We think about storytellers as manipulative Svengalis. They hypnotize us, they engross us, mesmerize, and trance, or we think about them as lovers. They infatuate us, captivate, intoxicate, seduce. Sometimes we talk about the experience of about storytellers like natural forces. They're like floods, they're like rivers, they're like winds. They sweep us up, they carry us away. And very often we speak of them as witches or wizards who enchant us, charm us, bewitch us. They leave us spellbound. What's interesting to me about all of those metaphors, they all describe story as a force that we are subject to and that we have no control over. In all these metaphors, the story consumer's agency is annihilated by the storyteller. And this could only be a good thing if we were under the misapprehension that storytellers were all good people and stories were inherently good things. But this guy, Plato, was under no such misapprehension. In the Republic, he's trying to design an ideal society, a perfect society. He's writing a blueprint for utopia. And he says, step one, take all the storytellers, round them up, throw them off the wall. So it's a good thing Plato isn't here today, because if he were, he would liquidate this room. He'd drive you guys wailing off into the wilderness. Why would he do this? Well, he considered storytellers to be professional liars. He thought they, on purpose, got people drunk on emotion so they could, in his phrase, quote, cripple the mind and control people. This has long been seen as the most ruthless insult against storytelling ever conceived by a great thinker. But I think we in this room should actually see it as a compliment. The Republic is an expression of Plato's awe-stricken fear at this spooky, mind-warping capacity that stories have. We now know that Plato massively underestimated storytelling's grip on our species. Storytelling instincts are embedded deep in the brain, and there's no way to banish them that doesn't involve a skull saw and a scalpel and Luke's grandfather. But we shouldn't let Plato's very bad solution to the problem of storytelling blind us to the fact that there is indeed a problem. I think we love stories so much that we have difficulty being wary of them. We just have so much love for them, so much eagerness for them. They seem like an inherently good thing. But this gives us sort of an enormous blind spot. So we think of stories as weak when they're strong. We think they're frivolous when they're serious as hell. We hold stories innocent when, as one scientist of storytelling puts it, there is nothing that is less innocent than a story. And now, as this slide suggests, our technology is making our stories more powerful, more ubiquitous, more divisive, and more weaponizable than somebody like Plato could have ever dreamed. So let me leave you with this. I'm a quasi-Platonist. I'm a halfway Platonist. I believe story is the best thing in the world, but I also suspect that it may be the worst. To paraphrase another famous ancient Greek, this guy, if story is the solution to all our problems, we should also keep in mind that it's also the cause of them all. So as storytellers, we bear this enormous burden of responsibility. The science is mostly settled. Storytellers, even the fiction makers, are not merchants of inert escapism. Stories shape minds. Stories change cultures. And storytellers, including all of us in this room, will help to author the future. And the only question is whether we will write us toward a brighter world or a darker one. Thank you very much.